If you had to name one person in our history who tackled the problem of floods, it would be Gilbert White. He started his career during a period of particularly devastating floods in the United States, floods that displaced hundreds of thousands of people.
And I first started getting serious interest in flood problems in 1934. I had finished work for a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at the University of Chicago, Department of Geography. And I was about to start on my doctorate dissertation on floods when my supervising professor said, would I come to Washington and work with him for 8 months on a study of the Mississippi Valley waters, including floods and irrigation. So I went off to Washington for 8 months, and I stayed 8 years.
Gilbert White didn't just stay in Washington. He worked his way up to the White House. It wasn't long before he was advising President Franklin Roosevelt on matters of natural resources. And in his spare time, he was writing a doctoral dissertation for the ages, Human Adjustment to Floods. In this dissertation, he articulated with an unprecedented clarity how structural efforts to control nature, like dams and levees, might actually enhance the problem, might make it more intractable. Gilbert argued instead that the path to resilience was a balance between structural approaches and softer approaches that had to do with people's use of land. Instead of moving water away from people, he argued that people should move away from water. Gilbert didn't finish his dissertation at just any time in history. He happened to finish it a few months after the U.S. entry into World War II. And he didn't do what you and I and most experts of any stripe would do, particularly if we had a White House job. He didn't say, oh, well, I'm needed here where my expertise matters. He embedded himself in the south of France, not with a gun, but with a Quaker sense of purpose that there were people of peace he needed to help out. Saved many lives while he was doing that, but it was dangerous work, and he was caught by the Nazis and interned in Europe for the remainder of the war. Because he was so young, when he returned from the war, he was at the start of a vast and varied career. Much of that was spent in different academic roles, but he always kept returning to hazards, environmental problems, and especially floods. And of course, the devastating floods kept coming.
1916, 1922, 1937. We built 100 cities and 1,000 towns, but at what a cost.
Gilbert's work had been growing in reputation during this time, and much of that stemmed from his insight, which was summarized in this quote: "Floods are acts of God, but flood losses are largely acts of man." Let that sink in a bit. So moving forward to the 1960s, Gilbert White was asked to review the idea of a national flood insurance program. He's interested in this as an incentive for communities to adopt more resilient practices. He had seen how challenging it was to get enforceable regulations, so he was looking for an incentive. The flood insurance wasn't an end in itself. It was designed to encourage communities to adopt and enforce better floodplain regulations. But Gilbert was concerned, wary. He spoke openly about the threat that subsidies to that insurance, charges below the rates that the private market would support, would aggravate the whole flood problem if not very carefully managed and thoughtfully implement it. Gilbert was also deeply concerned about using the 100-year flood standard as the basis for any future insurance program. The selection of this standard was essentially experimental, merely a starting point. He was told by the NFIP administrator it would be assessed and changed if needed as time progressed.
I was chair of the special committee that was set up by the Bureau of the Budget, and that wrote the report on the idea of having national flood insurance. And our task force was quite explicit in saying that there should be an appraisal of, after a few years, of what would seem to be the effect of the regulations. But it is also fairly clear that there is not interest in the part of the government at present in re-examining the idea of using the 100-year flood as a criterion.
Today, of course, floods have gotten more frequent, they've gotten more severe, and the costs of the program have exploded. The claims against the flood insurance program amount to tens of billions of dollars. The forgiven claims amount to $16 billion. But those figures don't speak to the total cost of failure to adjust to the flood problem. The cost in human suffering, devastated lives, individual financial calamity, social disruption, health problems, death itself. Those scenes from Gilbert's early years are still repeating, and so were the costs. The good news is we've got a strong FEMA. We've got a well-equipped, well-trained, highly motivated, passionate workforce. They're working domestically and abroad. They're working at state and local levels with tribal nations, and every piece of FEMA, including the National Flood Insurance Program, is contributing. But the disasters continue to roll on and roll over us. Costs are mounting, the frequency are going up, the number of people impacted is going up. We're losing ground on this problem. We're increasing our exposure in hazardous areas. We're still building and rebuilding in floodplain. So the big news is future problems are going to dwarf the problems of the past. We have to be realistic about the future. We've hardwired a lot of vulnerability into the system over the last 50 years by building too low, by building extensively in the floodplain, by building inadequately. And those vulnerabilities are going to be exposed by the climate change of the future. That climate is going to have more extremes. They're going to be of greater magnitude, greater duration. They're going to be occurring and reoccurring in time short compared with our ability to recover. And so we have a social challenge in front of us. As Gilbert said, disasters are largely a human construct. In the same way, resiliency can only be a human construct. It's up to us to harness tomorrow's tools to deal with these challenges of the future. But more importantly, more fundamentally, as Gilbert the Quaker, as Gilbert the humanitarian would say, we have to build a sense of responsibility into our actions. We need to do that if we're going to get past adjustment to floods as an aspiration and get to adjustment to floods as a reality.